Hey, so there's something really interesting about people who ride the same motorbike for 10 years straight. And I'm not just talking about someone who can't afford a new one. I'm talking about people who actively choose to keep the same bike year after year when they could upgrade. Psychologically, this says a lot about a person. Actually, it says a lot of different things depending on who you are. But there's a thread running through all of it that's worth understanding. First, let's talk about what most people see. They see someone on the same bike and they think, oh, that person can't afford a new one, or they're just practical. But that misses the whole story, because there's a real choice happening here. There's a decision being made. So what does that choice reveal? Well, one of the big ones is loyalty. And I don't just mean loyalty to an object. I mean loyalty as a character trait. People who keep the same bike for 10 years tend to be people who don't abandon things easily. They commit to things. They see things through. There's a consistency there that says something about how they approach life in general. But here's where it gets more interesting. Psychologically, this also reveals something about control and predictability. Your bike becomes familiar. You know every sound it makes. You know how it handles. You know its quirks. And that's comforting. There's no surprise. There's no learning curve. There's no anxiety about whether this new model is going to be reliable or if you made the wrong choice. For a lot of people, that familiarity is everything. It's grounding. It's safe. Especially if you ride a motorbike, which is inherently kind of dangerous and requires you to be hyper-aware. Having that one constant, that one thing you completely trust, becomes psychologically important. Therapists would probably point out that this can sometimes be a trauma response. If you've experienced loss or instability, if you've had things taken away from you or changed suddenly, then holding onto something becomes a way of asserting control. It's a way of saying, this one thing is mine. This one thing doesn't change. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's actually a healthy way to ground yourself. There's also something about identity here. Your bike becomes part of who you are. It's not just transportation. It's not just a vehicle. It's an extension of yourself. People recognize you by your bike. You've built a history with it. You've taken it places. You've had experiences on it. You've probably learned things about yourself while riding it. And letting go of that means letting go of a piece of your identity. Now, the flip side is interesting too. Motorbikes are symbols of freedom, right? They're symbols of independence and rebellion and not being tied down. So there's this paradox where someone who's riding a bike to feel free is also choosing to stay with the same bike for 10 years. It's not the obvious contradiction it seems like, though, because the freedom they're seeking isn't about constantly changing things or chasing the new. The freedom is in the simplicity. The freedom is in not being enslaved to consumption. The freedom is in knowing their machine so well that they can go anywhere without worry. There's also a practicality to this that's psychological. People who keep the same bike know it inside and out. They know what it needs. They know how to maintain it. They can fix most problems themselves. There's an expertise there, a mastery, and mastery feels good. Mastery creates confidence. So every time you get on that bike, you're not learning a new system. You're not trying to figure out where things are. You're just riding. You're completely in flow. This connects to something psychologists call cognitive ease. When things are familiar, our brains don't have to work as hard. We can relax. We can focus on the actual experience of riding rather than worrying about whether we made the right purchase decision or whether this new bike is reliable. But let me dig deeper into what this says about values. People who keep the same motorbike for 10 years often have different values than people who constantly upgrade. They don't define themselves by having the newest thing. They don't need external validation through status symbols. They're not trying to prove anything through what they own. There's actually a kind of confidence in that, a kind of security. It says, I know who I am. I don't need to buy a new identity every couple of years. There's also something environmental about it. Keeping the same bike means you're not consuming. You're not creating waste. You're not supporting the endless cycle of planned obsolescence. And that actually reveals something about someone's consciousness. They're thinking about the world beyond themselves. They're making choices based on values that extend beyond just personal satisfaction. Now here's something else. People who ride motorbikes are different from people who drive cars. There's an element of presence required. You can't zone out on a bike. You have to be aware. You have to be engaged. And if you're doing that for 10 years on the same bike, you've had 10 years of that focused presence with the same machine. You've developed an intuition with it. You know how it's going to lean. You know how it's going to respond. You trust it on a visceral level. That level of trust is psychologically significant because trust is rare. Trust in objects, trust in people, trust in yourself. It all takes time to build. And once you have it, giving it up feels like a loss. There's also the narrative aspect. Your bike becomes a story. It's not just a motorbike, it's the bike you've had for 10 years. It's the bike you rode through that difficult period. It's the bike that broke down on that road trip. It's the bike that's been with you through changes. And that narrative matters to our psychology. We're storytelling creatures. We create meaning through stories. And your bike has become a character in your story. Interestingly, psychologists would also note that this can sometimes indicate a fear of change. If someone is too attached to keeping things exactly the same, if they're resistant to upgrading even when they could benefit from it, that might reveal some anxiety about change itself. Maybe they're afraid of the new. Maybe they've had negative experiences with change. Maybe they feel like if they change this one thing, other things will start to change too, and they'll lose control. But most of the time, it's not that deep. Most of the time, people who keep the same bike for 10 years are just practical. They're not materialistic. They've found something that works and they're sticking with it. They're intentional about their choices. They're not swept up in consumer culture. There's also something about resilience here. Because bikes break down, they need maintenance. They age, but you keep them running. You fix them. You adapt to them as they change. And that teaches you something about resilience. It teaches you that you don't need the newest or the best. You just need something reliable and the willingness to take care of it. People who do this often become very skilled at maintenance and repair. They learn how their bike works. They learn to troubleshoot problems. They learn to keep it running. And that knowledge and those skills become valuable. They become self-sufficient. They're not dependent on dealerships or manufacturers. They can figure things out themselves. Psychologically, that's actually really empowering. There's a sense of competence that comes from being able to maintain and repair something yourself. It's different from just driving or riding something that someone else maintains for you. Here's something else worth considering. Motorbike riders who keep the same bike are often part of a community, and not in a consumer way. They're part of the community of people who value experience over status. They're part of the community of people who understand bikes deeply. And community matters for our psychology. It shapes how we see ourselves. It reinforces our values. The fact that someone will choose to be in a community of people who don't constantly upgrade, who value their machines, who respect the experience of riding, that says something about who they are and what matters to them. Now let's talk about the relationship aspect. Because people who ride the same bike for 10 years often talk about their bike the way other people talk about relationships. They have a bond with it. They understand its moods. They know how to work with it. They know its limitations. And they accept those limitations. They don't expect perfection from it. They just expect consistency and reliability. That's actually a healthy way to relate to anything, honestly. Acceptance of limitations, appreciation for consistency, willingness to work with something as it ages. There's a lesson there about how to approach relationships with people too. There's also something about simplicity here that's worth exploring. In a world that's constantly pushing more, newer, faster, better, someone who chooses to keep the same bike is choosing simplicity. And simplicity is psychologically healthy. It reduces decision fatigue. It reduces anxiety. It allows you to focus on what actually matters, the experience of riding, the connection to your bike, the freedom of the road, not the specs, not the features, not the status. Therapists would probably say that this is a sign of someone who has their priorities straight. someone who's not caught up in external validation, someone who's not running on the hedonic treadmill where you constantly need something new to feel satisfied, someone who can find satisfaction and meaning in the familiar. But I think the deepest thing this reveals is about continuity and identity. We're creatures who need continuity. We need to feel like there's a thread connecting our past to our present. We need to feel like we have a history. And when you ride the same bike for 10 years, that bike becomes a symbol of your continuity. It becomes a way of saying, I am someone who follows through. I am someone who's consistent. I am someone who doesn't need to constantly reinvent myself. And in a world where people are constantly changing their appearance, their careers, their relationships, their opinions, having that one constant can be really psychologically grounding. So what does it all mean? When you see someone riding the same motorbike for 10 years, you're looking at someone who values reliability over novelty, someone who values experience over status, someone who's practical and self-sufficient, someone who's secure enough in who they are that they don't need to constantly upgrade, someone who understands that the newest thing isn't always the best thing, someone who's found something that works and they're committed to it. And honestly, there's something admirable in that. In a consumer culture that's constantly telling us to buy more, own more, upgrade more, have the latest, there's something powerful about someone who says, no, this is enough. This works for me. I'm staying. That bike isn't just a vehicle. It's a statement. It's a way of living. And that says a lot about who that person really is.